I don't want to bother you with detailed questions, but a couple of general questions regarding some, different aspects of poetry. First of all, what's the aim of poetry for you? Can it still influence the people in times of, fluid modernity, digital panopticon? So what's your opinion on that?
Even if the idea that poetic freedom is delusional, I like that about poetry, that it's a delusional space of poetic freedom. For me, it's better than a delusional space of conformity, convention, and bureaucracy. So perhaps life is always to some degree a delusion, but I bring out the ludic in the delusion. That is to say, the playfulness, the aesthetic pleasure. So it needs to say pleasurable for me. It needs to let me think about things in a different way even than I have before. It's very easy when you've written stuff for 50 years, as I have, not to fall back on the same kinds of things. And I do to some degree. But one thing I do discover is that some things that I write really disturb me. They trouble me. I wonder if they'll be misinterpreted. Maybe I'm saying the wrong thing. Maybe I'm pushing it too far. And that's a good thing. It's good to have a certain level of anxiety and not feel complacent. So for me, the work exists without the need for justification. And I leave it to others to determine whether it's worthwhile for them to read. But of course, I do hope that people read the work, and the work of people that I care about, I put forward, I profess. I also recognize that in the US, but not just in the US, certainly in Europe and in South America, poetry is a very unpopular field. It's a very obscure thing. People keep up with pop music, with streaming TV series, with the news, with novels to some degree, movies, political biography, but poetry doesn't really exist as an area that has a substantial claim on popular culture. But for me, that doesn't make it less significant. I always say it's the irony that in a way that's what makes poetry especially significant. Not that I wouldn't be happy for things to be different, but given that's the condition, then you can work in ways that these other genres can't work. So with every limitation, there are possibilities, and to accept those possibilities is what can make for powerful art and for powerful poetry. Because poetry, the fact that it is so insignificant in the wider culture, both in the intellectual culture in universities and the national culture, as well as the popular culture, but certainly the high intellectual culture as well, is very striking, because after all, poetry is the art of language, verbal language. Verbal language always remains fundamental within our culture and our society. So if the art form that actually most potentially can reflect upon verbal language is so marginal, it becomes even more urgent to continue with it and to allow its neglect to become part of how it enters into the world. Because the neglect of poetry in our culture is, to my view, a detriment to our culture. There are many things that are very detrimental about US culture. And this does reflect something problematic. So I don't have I do have a very strong sense of the value of aesthetics and poetry and what the loss of valuing aesthetics and poetry is within a culture. And I certainly experienced that in the United States, although there are many people who are, who share my view. I'm not alone, but it's a significant group.
These questions, about the definition of poetry. You know, especially the Western definition of poetry distorts our view of the longer human experience. You know, I mean, there are two main roles for poetry. One is playing with the language, and the other, one focuses on life. You know, in an urge to speak, in an urge to change life. You know, the thing is that you cannot change life without changing the language, and vice versa. You know, as Marx says, you know, the point is to change, not to interpret. So I think that you combine them together. And this is a kind of paradox. You know, what's your opinion on that? You know, thinking of Wittgenstein as well. And language poetry as well.
You and I, or not just you and I, but the six of us are brought together and can have a conversation. That you could do that magazine and ask me questions and translate it, and that it makes sense to us. And I'm really interested in these kinds of affinities and exchanges. Not even that you fully understand what I'm saying or that I fully translate or understand what you're saying, but just the connection itself, the kind of coming together where like cats cradle, perhaps, or intertwine ourselves or going back and forth. Because a lot of people that I know would not accept the premise that you made, that if we change, in order to change the world, we have to change language. And you seem to think that might be the case. I do think that that's so, but I also know that there's a lot of hostility to that idea. There's a lot of idea that poetry should be conveying various kinds of positions or experiences that are not in language, but they're conveyed through language, and that the words you use aren't going to change what that is. So for me, part of the struggle with poetry is to make visceral how much it's a means of perception, and that changing the terms and the language changes what that perception is. And however, I don't think that's what poetry is. I think poetry is an ancient art form. It means that's a very powerful thing. We're using the term poetry for that in Turkey and me in New York, but it means so many different things to so many different people. And like politics, and even like love, there are conflicting ideas of what it is and what counts and what's legitimate. I mean, even with love, there's a long history of certain kinds of love being denied. That's not, this isn't real love, that can't be, or not a proper kind of love. So there's no way that we're going to unify a definition, unify the definitions of poetry, except in the most generic sense that it's the art of verbal language. But certainly within different traditions, and that's what interests me, because the traditions are not the same, that you and I can be talking here, you know, on Zoom through this video feed and talk about something about the non-instrumental nature of poetry, something about the fact that language affects change, and that if you want change, you have at least to consider the words that you're using, or the phrases, or the syntax, or the overall language, and make that kind of connection. You know, that's one kind of poetry. My early
I have a question from Content Stream.
Yeah.
You say in the book, there are no thoughts except through language. We are everywhere seen through it, limited to it, but not by it. What I deduce from this phrase is that we are not limited by the language when looking at a poem. Am I right? Can we dream anything outside the content? Or if we say like Derrida, is there anything outside the text?
People often say when something terrible happens, I have no words for that. For example, a condolence. I have no words to express my sorrow or my grief for what you are going through. And unfortunately, one can't help but hear that and be in a world in which terrible things happen every day. Of course, I appreciate that sentiment, but I always want to say the opposite in a sense. I have only words for that, because the only way that I can come to terms even with the most acute tragedy or the greatest ecstasy is through the metaphors and the language in which I speak. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that seem to be outside of that language, but nonetheless, they're conditioned by it and expressed by it. So even if I say, I have no words to express my sorrow that this terrible thing has happened to you, that is, of course, a verbal expression. It's in fact a cliche. It's a formula. It's like a prayer for saying something. It isn't without words. So it seems to me the objection to this view, which I often hear, is that of course there's a world that exists pre-existing outside of human beings. If all human beings were gone, if there were no human beings, would there still be a world? You know, it's like if a tree falls in the forest, would you still hear? But the question is, why would you be asking that question? What would it mean for us to be talking about a world without human beings? I do think, as a matter of fact, there's no question that there's a world, that there's an earth, that there's a universe that exists independent of human beings. But I don't think that my perception of it is independent of human beings, and my perception is language bound. It's like oxygen. So there may be something outside of the bounds, and indeed there is, outside of the bounds of human being, but my experience of the universe is as a human being.
Poetry is not made of ideas, but words.
Yeah.
This statement is quoted from Mallarmé. You read in your interview with Dworkin a parody poem from your book,
Right?
Top Story. Yeah. By quoting and transforming, you make permutations, as I understand, as far as I understand. Do you think parody is an intrinsic, constructive, or subversive power in all arts? Or is it a simple technique which we can ignore? For example, T.S. Eliot says immature poets imitate mature poets' tale.
Right.
Heidegger thinks that all art is allegorical. What's your opinion about regarding parody?
Well, you know, you're speaking to a person who is very involved with parody and the comic and the satiric and irony. So and very kind of uncomfortable with certain aspects of sincerity as in contrast. So I certainly think those things are valuable and crucial. I do think it's possible within poetry for people to for people to write in a non-parodic way, at least in the humorous sense, in that sense of word. But you're actually saying something that's more complicated and harder to get outside of when you're saying not. It's like irony. I have a line in one of my poems, you know, the famous Socrates line, that the unreflected life is not worth living. I say the unironic life is not worth living. The unironized life is not worth living. But I would say to some degree, like the parody, irony in that sense, self-reflection is itself ironic and parodic. So to think is parody and irony. Now, I know a lot of people don't feel that way. A lot of people really believe in a kind of rooted, sincere authenticity. And I hear that. It's not my, especially people with deep beliefs, often people with religious beliefs. There are certain things that are sacred that you can't you can't make fun of, you can't satirize, you can't relativize. I'm not one of those people, but I hear that as an important part of human culture, and I'm not an epistemological suprematist. I don't believe that my way of looking at what's valuable and knowledgeable is the only one. I think there are other absolutely contradictory ones, and I wish to live in peace with these other epistemologies. However, often these other epistemological perspectives would like to destroy folks like me or people who think what I think. So that I'm less comfortable with. So if we can have a coexistence, it's good. But if one view says, no, that can't exist, then, you know, it's a problem. It's a problem. But you make a more profound point, really, that a non-ironic parody based on the idea that we are parasitic even on the culture that we're in, and that we absorb. Parasitic is a problem with the word. Para is just next to, like parallel, but parasitic suggests something bad. But I would say if we could have a sense of it, as you're saying with parody, an ode next to, all that I am is absorbed from the culture that precedes me and the culture that surrounds me. So yes, I think everyone who uses human language, human culture, is completely immersed in the past, in tradition, in other, if we're poets, previous examples of poetry that we know, as well as the contemporary language and cultural world that surrounds us, and that we're porous, that enters into us. We can't stop it from entering. We can't make ourselves resist that. And in fact, I would say we embrace it. It's like swimming. You swim within it and you move around, but you still have the water.
Do you think the 2 years we spent in a postmodern quarantine, in a pandemic, have this created a different understanding of thought or poetry? I'm asking both from your point of view and from the point of general thoughts and artistic adventure. Do we need to make a distinction between the possibilities and experiments of poetry as before and after the pandemic?
You know, when terrible things happen, one pulls one's hair out, and when you're old like me, you don't have any hair to pull out anymore, so it's difficult, but with the little bit you grab onto. We're about hitting the 20th anniversary of September 11th, 2001 here in New York, and so I remember that was a terrible thing for New York. A lot of terrible things have happened elsewhere, all over the world, every year since that time. But you know, for those living in New York, it was a pretty amazing and horrific thing. Question would come up: what do we do? Can the poems that we're writing or the art live in the face of this? And you know, there's a crisis quite often since then. Pandemic being a different one. The pandemic also is intimately connected to the climate crisis and globalization, which we've been experiencing for a long time, because the pandemic is involved with the interweaving of our viral culture and bacterial, well, viral culture in this case, bacterial culture, and which we can't separate anymore. We could try to stop plane flights and so on, but it reflects that. So I wrote poems responding to these specific things and to the larger questions. All of this conversation that we've had could be thought of as responding to the question of the human crisis, or the crisis of the human, or what I call sometimes animality, not animality, not being animal, but the malady or sickness of being animal, not even human. So the pandemic brings that out. And of course, Brooklyn, New York, here where I am, was one of the epicenters of the pandemic at one point. You know, a year and a half ago, anyway, we had the highest infection rate in these streets that I live in. So, but it was a global problem, and it remains a global problem. So I think, as I say in my work that I wrote in 9/11, it isn't whether art is up for this, but what else is art for? What else is poetry for? So I don't mean to say this as a point of pride, although, and it's hard not to, but everything I've always written has come out of a sense of crisis. So when the crisis occurs, it isn't like, oh, why am I still going to be doing this other stuff which seems irrelevant? So even with teaching, people say, you're going back, I've had, terrible things happen in your life, to all of us. And you go back into the class after this catastrophic thing happens, but it's not as if what I'm talking about, poems or like talking to you, is somehow not what I'm able to talk about under that circumstance, because that's what the poetry that I taught did speak to. So for me, it makes the necessity of the work, to go back to the very first questions you asked, why write? What's the point? What it makes the necessity even greater, and my commitment to work even harder, to be more disruptive, to question my own assumptions, and to also do that not isolated, physically distant, but socially intimate, like this is. We're physically distant, but we're trying to have a conversation. And then the necessity for conversation across barriers, so that our conversations will be as viral for poetry and as thought as the COVID is destructive to our bodies. We have to create poetry that's viral in an aesthetic sense, in a good sense, crossing those boundaries, breaking through and creating new mutations of poetry, new mutations of possibility, to combat all of the biological and political, because the COVID crisis is of course biological, but it's fundamentally political as well. You can't differentiate those realms. They're completely interwoven. And we will see that in the years to come as to how that outcome is for this problem. In the same way that the climate change is a problem of the earth that seeps into the world. If the earth is the physical thing that's outside of the world, and in some ways, while poetry is in and of the world, the human world, it's the closest that we get to the earth.
It is a personal question. When I was a teenager, I used to write a lot of poems, but now I don't write anymore. So I want some advice from you. I want to start again. Actually, I want to be that girl, not this girl. I want your advice on that.
The question is really why you would continue to write, not why you should start to write when you stop. I mean, why? I think the more interesting question is, how can I stop? I've not been able to stop. I think if you're not writing, God, you're better off. You're better off. You'll just bring you heartache and disappointment. I can't see any reason to encourage you to write poetry. So it's really something to do because you just can't do anything else, but not for any other purpose. And if you can do something else, then, by all means do it. I think those of us who stick with poetry, it's really, we're not, it's just, we're addicted to it. We'd like to stop, but we can't.